What if we could learn from outstanding leaders in business, sports, and education from some of the best voices in corporate America? Lighting the Path is a series of interviews with industry leaders whose stories highlight strategies that build purpose-driven cultures, engage and retain top talent, develop drivers that create high-performance teams, and connect people to the vision of your company. Join us to hear from game-changing, talented leaders whose paths make a difference at work and at home.
Our guest today understands the meaning of leading from the jump seat better than almost anybody I've met. Peter Docker spent 25 years with the Royal Air Force and over 14 years helping companies on a global basis chart new courses and expand their leadership capabilities. He's authored this book called Leading from the Jump Seat, which is totally about as leaders were called on to turn control over to those individuals whose capabilities can take organization, help them to take flight in the new directions, many times better than we could ourselves. So sit back and enjoy and be stimulated by Peter Docker, author of Leading from the Jump Seat. Peter, I was so looking forward to getting a chance to visit with you today on a subject that I live in, which is leadership. And just because of the fact that most of us get into leadership roles, I call it by osmosis. In other words, we get thrust into a leadership position and then we make a bunch of mistakes and then bang our head up against the wall and say, I'm not doing that again. But you have chronicled this amazing book that's called Leading from the Jump Seat. And I love the sort of the tagline that goes with it, the mission of it, how to create extraordinary opportunities by handing over control. And being somebody who, from a leadership standpoint, spent most of my time trying to figure out ways of how can I control the outcome? How can I control the people? Because if I do that, then I'm a good leader. Your history of going this, especially this jump seat, you started your early career in leading as a pilot and then teaching and training other pilots. How did you end up from there to where you are now?
Well, it's been quite a journey. I feel I've had a great privileged life in so many ways, Mike. I joined the Air Force when I was in my very early 20s and had a career with the Royal Air Force for about 25 years, principally as a pilot. But then after a while, I was promoted and you spend less time flying, more time looking after the people who do the flying, you know. So that particular career took me through some extraordinary experiences, including leading people during combat in 2003, the Iraq War, which I learned a lot about myself and about leading then. I think the point of that, just to dwell on that for a moment, is that when we're in extreme situations, we learn what really makes people tick. And those lessons can apply in less extreme situations. So that was a pivotal moment for me, but also leading as a pilot myself when I've had aircraft emergencies. I used to fly large passenger jets mainly. And the flight deck of an aircraft is like a microcosm of leadership for me. You can get some of the most fantastic leadership. And frankly, sometimes you can get some of the worst, but most of the time it tends to be pretty good. So the flying side of it has been a big part of my life. But also in the Air Force, I ran multi-billion-dollar projects. I was a negotiator for the UK government when the Berlin Wall came down with the Russians, and then subsequently with the State Department of the US on export licensing and all sorts. I've taught at the Defence College here in the UK on leadership, and also worked, when I left the Air Force, worked in consulting with companies in, well, lots of industries, oil and gas, mining. And then subsequently, in the last 8 years, I've been going around giving talks and working with the senior leadership teams of, well, about 100 or more companies around the world, and some of the biggest companies. So it's been a huge privilege, this journey, to meet so many different people from so many backgrounds and different industries, and learn what it is that brings us together and helps us work well together to achieve more than perhaps we might otherwise assume. like you, I've been in this field of leadership and just reflecting really for quite some time. And I don't think there are any fundamentally new ideas out there, but I think it's the cocktail that with which you bring things together. And, you know, my particular cocktail comes from my background, you know, but I've drawn various ideas together, which I'm sure you would recognize in one way, shape or form. But I think what makes it different is the way you bring them together, and it will appeal to different people. And by that we help more people. So very good.
I refer to what your book is about, Peter. I refer to it as a prism, not prison, but prism.
Yeah.
But you know, it's you know, that crystal glass thing that light hits it and it refracts and it separates in all these lights. And depending upon where the person is in their walk and their place and their time, the message is going to hit them in a different manner, in a different way. And I love the concept that you have in here of you know, your three prime areas, which is about commitment, it's about humble confidence, and about belonging. I can't move on without having you talk on something, because of the fact that you have this military background, and you know, my father was a Marine. I have a cousin who was a decorated officer in Vietnam, and so I don't have military background, but I'm a fan of people who lead in what I think of the most intense, difficult circumstances that you could have whenever you're dealing in a battle situation. And now you're adding on top of that, which is on a flight deck of a commercial plane. And you have to understand, I don't like to hear the word plane and flight and emergency coming from the captain. I cringe with the thought that those things might possibly happen. But when you look at your experience, you've used your experiences from military and brought that into sort of a corporate setting. What did you learn about dealing with people and that are following you, and getting people to follow you to do things that are sometimes, as somebody pointed out to me, where you step into danger as opposed to moving away from it, which is human reaction?
Yeah, well, let's dive into that, because I think you bring up a really important point, Mike. You know, when I sat down and reflected, when I started writing this book, it occurred to me that everything that's really important to us in life, everything, is driven by one or two things. It's either driven by fear or it's driven by love. Now, fear is generated inside of us when we feel that our life, our livelihood, our status or reputation is threatened. Now, the first one, you know, when our life is threatened, if we step out onto the street and a car's coming, you know, fear will kick in and have us react by jumping out of the way, hopefully. So, you know, that's good. But quite often fear arises in those other circumstances when our livelihood, status or reputation are threatened. And then it's not necessarily quite so useful, you know, and fear can show up as, well, ego is the big one, where we focus just on ourselves. You know, ego is Greek for I. Or we start to think just, well, it's self-preservation. We don't consider others. It's all about me. We have a view of the world which is based around scarcity. Yeah. Or the other side of fear, we can become timid and take a step back and disengage. And none of these drivers really are helpful to us, excuse me, in a leadership situation. And so we can choose to be driven instead by love. And love shows up in the workplace and in life as being a stand for something, thinking of others, being in service of something other than ourselves. We have a worldview which is based around possibility and opportunity, not scarcity. Mm-hmm. And instead of being driven by ego, we have the opportunity to be driven by humble confidence. And humble confidence is where we have the humility to listen to others, to get their inputs, but also we have the resolute focus on where we're going and the willingness to make a decision when one needs to be taken. And so all these factors, whether you're in a war zone situation where fear does kick in, or in a corporate situation where perhaps your business is threatened, your livelihood is threatened, or your particular status or reputation is called into question, we do have a choice. We can either go with that fear driver, or we can choose to source ourselves from love and all those things I mentioned there. We always have that choice. And if we go with fear, we tend to close things down. If we go with the love drivers, such as humble confidence and seeing possibility and opportunity, then it becomes generative, and many, many more opportunities open up than they would if we were governed by fear.
Yeah, I
So
love
that's
this.
the link, I think.
Are you saying that we need to have more love in corporate America as leaders?
Yeah, and you know, as a Brit, we as a culture tend to shy away from.
That's why I asked that,
sort of
with a
thing.
smile on my voice. Yeah.
And you know, let's get over it, because unfortunately that four-letter word of love is inadequate in many ways, because you know, we talk about loving our husband, wife, partner, brother, sister, our work, or whatever. It's all the same word, but actually it encapsulates so many feelings. But when we get to the base of it, it is for something rather than against something.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's about being in service of something which is more than just about ourselves. So you know, there have been a lot of examples, well documented over time, some of which I mentioned in the book, where people being faced with really challenging situations have prevailed because of their love for something, rather than being driven by the fear, which is probably would have been their initial reaction.
Yeah, when I was looking at the manuscript you had sent over, I was caught up with the fact that from a leadership standpoint, your book really chronicles something I believe strongly in, which is the role of a leader is to create an atmosphere of hope.
Yeah,
That's a driving force as a leader, that something can be better, more of, different.
yeah,
Change could take place, and so we have to develop communication skills. And so when you look at the sort of the three, I guess you would call it channels that you go down, is there anyone in particular that you think hits hard on the aspect of the role of leader, making sure that you bring effective communication and bring clarity to situations and circumstances to create the results that you're trying to drive and you feel responsible for?
Well, you know, Mike, the way I've brought it together in the book, I refer, if you like, to three buckets. The first section of the book is based around ideas that relate to the notion of commitment and what commitment really means and where that comes from. The second chunk of the book is about humble confidence, and we've already touched on that in this conversation. And I go into some depth about what that opens up in terms of possibility of moving your team forward. And then the final part is around belonging, which is where the hope side of it comes in as well, and nurturing a sense of belonging. So all these things work together in unison. On the belonging side and the hope side, for example, hope is very powerful. It's a very human thing. And for me, it goes beyond optimism. You know, optimism is great, but often it can be attached with a timeline. So, you know, let's look at the pandemic that has just gone. For example, people have said in our country, oh, it'll be over by Christmas, or it'll be over by Easter, or whatever. And those times come and go. And you know, but actually, if we have instead the notion of hope, hope is about a belief in there will be an after. Mm-hmm. And to keep that belief alive is the role, in my view, of a leader. You know, when I've been leading people during the Iraq War, for example, in 2003, I didn't know when it was going to end. I didn't know when we were going to be allowed to fly home. But I have a hope that there will be an after. We will be going home at some stage. And you have to keep that alive, because that then creates the environment where people are more willing to step up, to take responsibility for leading themselves as well as others around them. And it creates a generative context for people within which to work. So hope is really important on the belonging side. Humble confidence instead of ego is hugely important.
Absolutely.
Just picking up on that just briefly, humble confidence draws in the notion that if we want to really excel when we have a formal leadership role, then we're going to be held back if we feel we've always got to be the one with the answer to the problem. Yeah,
I want you to talk about that, because of the fact that when the leaders that I've met, one of the obstacles that, and I shouldn't say we all fight with, is our ego of feeling like my sense of worth as a leader is being the go-to person, the person that gets results and that can make things happen. And so that I'm the problem solver. I sweep in with my cape and kind of deal with things. This book, this treatise really deals with this aspect of leadership, is literally turning loose of control, which means I got to get my ego out of the picture, don't I?
Absolutely. And first of all, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves that we face this issue around ego, because, when we're at school, we tend to focus on the subjects that we enjoy and we get good at. And then, if we go to college, university, whatever, we become more specialized, and then we're hired in a work role because of our expertise, say in computer programming, for example. And if we're really good at it, we'll get promoted. And then all of a sudden, we're not doing the programming anymore. We're looking after the people who are doing the programming. And that's where there is the big transition, which often isn't accounted for so much in business. And we feel out of our comfort zone when we first get to that position. And we want to continue to be the person with the answers because it feels good. It's literally feeds our ego, doesn't it? But if we have always got to be the person who has the answer, by definition, we can then become the bottleneck in the progress of our team. And so the opportunity is instead to focus on becoming comfortable not knowing the answer, and instead holding the space, keeping the context within which others on our team can step forward and help figure out the pieces to the answers that we're seeking. And that's our role, rather than knowing our answers ourselves. It's the important thing is to be able to ask the really good questions. That's what we need to focus on.
It's not the answers we give, is it? It's the questions that we ask. And as you're describing that, we were talking earlier. You're in England. I'm in Houston, Texas, which of course is home of NASA. And when you describe that, I can't think of a better example of something being out of control than the Apollo moon mission, which was Apollo 13, which did not go according to plan. Matter of fact, Tom Hanks made an amazing movie about that journey. And what are your thoughts about how that applies to what you're talking about?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right, Mike. This is a great example. And for listeners who don't recall, this is a true story. Apollo 13, it was one of the many Apollo missions sent up in the 60s and 70s by NASA to take astronauts to the moon. And Apollo 13, things had kind of got routine, we'd already put people on the moon and brought them back. And so not many people were watching on TV at that stage because they'd seen it all before, hadn't they? But en route to the moon on the 13th of April, 1970, Apollo 13 suffered an explosion and it blew the side of the spacecraft out. And at the time, neither the astronauts nor mission control at Houston knew what had happened. And it was potentially disastrous. Here were 3 astronauts hurtling away from the Earth towards the moon. They're about 2/3 of the way towards the moon. And they had a disabled spacecraft. What are they going to do? And at the time, in the hot seat, the head of mission control was a guy called Gene Kranz. He was 32 years old, Vietnam vet, pilot. And he had the job of trying to figure out what on earth to do. And the first thing he did, he shifted the context. There are just 2 things in this world, Mike. There's content and there's context. Content is the stuff that we do, things that we say, the work we're engaged in. But context is what gives that content meaning. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. All the content are the puzzle pieces on the table, but the context is the picture on the box, and that gives those puzzle pieces meaning. And for Apollo 13, the original context was to get 3 astronauts to the moon and bring them back safely. But in that moment, when that spacecraft exploded, Gene Kranz shifted the context. It was like turning the puzzle pieces over, because going to the moon was no longer a thing. They wouldn't be able to do that. The only aim of the mission was to bring those 3 astronauts home safely. And what he did, he didn't have all the answers. He didn't have any of the answers, but he did have a team of very, very skilled technicians who could help work it out. And that's exactly what they did. And what Gene focused on was holding that context, that picture on the box, making it as clear as possible, and giving his people the space they needed to work it out, how to keep those astronauts alive, how to bring them back to Earth, and how to have them splash down successfully in the Pacific. And that film, 1985 film, Apollo 13, it's one of the best examples, courtesy of Hollywood, I've seen, that brings actually most of the principles and ideas I share in my book. It brings it beautifully to life, and this is how to lead when you don't know the answer. And Gene Kranz was a master of it.
It was amazing because unfortunately, no one person knew the answers, did they? It was truly the most collaborative process I've ever seen of coming in with a mission of magnitude of people coming back in, and 99% of the suggestions that were brought forward from looking at it were wrong. Thanks for joining us today on Lighting the Path, Strategies for Tomorrow's Leaders. If anything in this podcast speaks to you, if I've challenged you, or if you want to spend time digging into this subject a little deeper, or if you disagree with me, reach out. My contact information is on our website, lightingthepath.net, or email me at mike@mikelejeune.com. Also, look for me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect our networks. Keep lighting the path for those who choose to follow you. It's more than a responsibility. It's an honor.